Good morning. Um, I'm a literary theorist by training, so that's what I have for you this morning. I want to talk about missionary stories. Um, the best 2 years, The Other Side of Heaven, The Saratov Approach, The Return Missionary, The Errands of Angels, Inspired Guns, On the Road to Heaven, Millstone City, Angel of the Donabe, The Treehouse, Tokyo South, Way Below the Angels, The Pretty Clearly Troubled but Not Even Close to Tragic Confessions of a Real-Life Mormon Missionary. It's my favorite title so far. God's Army, The Year of the Boar, Elders, The Accidental Terrorist, Confessions of a Reluctant Missionary, The Failed Life of a Mormon Missionary, and Dendo. If this list, and it's a very, very partial list, is anything to go by, missionary work is a very fruitful lens through which to tell Mormon stories. Mission stories are a cornerstone of LDS discourse, whether told in print, on film, or in a conversation between friends that starts with the iconic words, "When I was on my mission." In Mormon culture, missionaries are symbols of service and sacrifice. Male or female, neatly dressed, and always 2x2, they are Mormon markers upon the landscape, as easily recognizable as the standardized meeting houses or the opulent soaring temples located around the world. They are the literal embodiment of Joseph Smith's promise that one day his church would fill the world. Missionaries act as a bridge between the local and the centralized institutional church, and, I argue, are the primary way through which American Mormons encounter the international. And as such, I'm interested in what they have to say about global Mormonism. That Mormonism is Americentric is well known, although that is not to deny the vibrancy of the many Mormon congregations abroad. Scott Hales argues that America seems to be not only the setting of Mormonism, but also its protagonist, love interest, and best friend. Every other place, be it Brazil or Ghana or the Philippines, is a minor supporting character only, a foil or a digression. Despite the numbers of Mormons living outside the US, despite the self-conception of Mormonism as a new world religion, the Mormon story still struggles to escape Americentric narratives. And in this paper, I think of mission narratives not just as stories meant to edify or entertain or even inspire, but as performative acts that construct and maintain symbolic boundaries. Precisely because the proselytizing mission is such a marker of Mormon culture, a rite of passage, and a repository of spiritual experiences, mission stories are told and retold often. The details of a story may vary, but the standardization of missionary life, as exemplified by the White Bible and the many rules it contains, leads to a commonality of narratives about this experience. Whether the stories focus on attracting, overcoming a language barrier, teaching the discussions, baptizing converts, or maybe not baptizing converts, or fighting with a companion, patterns emerge that are then further fixed in place every time these stories are told, and so these stories shape your mission experience before, during, and even after a mission. Mormons are encouraged to weave together personal experiences and gospel principles in their storytelling, and these stories play an important role in spreading doctrine and cultural norms horizontally or locally from peer to peer, and so supplement and affirm the counsel received from Salt Lake City in General Conference and the like. In practice, performing mission stories is a viable strategy for building social capital and publicly affirming one's continued commitment to the institutional church. But telling mission stories also helps create and maintain a certain kind of Mormonism and a certain kind of Zion. This is a Mormonism in which a clear line of authority extends from members on the local level at the bottom up to the first presidency at the top, and importantly, geographically from Salt Lake City outward into the world. American Mormonism has thoroughly naturalized this binary opposition of center and periphery, of foreign and familiar, and of safe and unsafe. Even a cursory glance at the genre of English language missionary fiction makes this clear. Missionary narratives often emphasize the coming of age process, in which the protagonist takes a metaphorical, in this case literal, journey away from home and into the world, engaging in a process of self-discovery and self-formation. The Bildungsroman is especially suited to the Mormon experience because of the idea of eternal progression, in which the acquisition of knowledge and personal growth is a literally never-ending process that stretches from the premortal existence on the one hand to the afterlife on the other. And as you might expect, the imagined space of the mission is often conceptualized as a profoundly destabilizing place on a personal level. But a closer reading of missionary novels reveals that there's something more at play. Millstone City, Elders, On the Road to Heaven, The Treehouse, to name but a few, all of these books locate the destabilizing influence of a mission precisely in its foreign character. The foreign here so often functions as something strange and hostile and maybe even violent, or not maybe, even violent. In Coke Newell's On the Road to Heaven, which is set in Colombia, an elder responds to the anti-American taunts of a college student by, I quote, beating the living crap out of the guy, end quote. The college student ends up on the ground, sobbing and defenseless. And the elder's only response to the incident is a quick muttered, sorry man, it's been a long 2 years. In Elders Then, Ryan McElvain's 2013 novel, Elder McLeod is sent to Brazil, and he ends up fighting not just an investigator, but also his companion, grappling both of them to the ground in 2 separate scenes. What makes these scenes so disturbing is that both books seem to set up the violence as inevitable. Living in such a hostile environment, the books ask, what else would you expect? Or take Millstone City, which plays on the traditional tropes of a missionary story. Missionary is called to serve, missionary grows and learns and suffers setbacks, and missionary returns home. In this case, though the missionary is called to Brazil, and the book starts out much as you would expect, the problems quickly stop centering around missing his girlfriend and like a dogmatic mission president and those things. Rather, the elder witnesses a mob hit and has to run for his life with his companion, because you can't leave your companion behind. And he has organized crime and a corrupt police force at their heels. Quite literally, the whole of Brazil is unsafe for these 2 Americans. Literary theorist Roland Barthes writes about myth's ability to tame or empty of substance an image, making it into a homogenized symbol that maintains boundaries and keeps up existing hierarchies. I would argue that in these texts, and in some ways in LDS discourse as a whole, it is entire countries and continents that are tamed, made to fit a white American reading public's image of the other. And so the center versus periphery orientation is further fixed into place, and America remains the center place. As again, Scott Hales argues, the transnational landscape here is, quote, a place where American missionaries go to be tried and tested before they return home with honor, end quote. And I would add, real life begins in the form of school, work, marriage, and babies. But this is not the whole story, or rather, this is not the only story that can exist. The genre of missionary stories, like all texts, can be read against the grain. Aspasia Katsopoulos argues that there are always tensions between dominant ideology and subordinate discourses that reveal ideological contradictions that cannot be masked or reconciled. She calls these the dislocations between discourses and writes that they work to denaturalize objects, relations, and behaviors that the dominant ideology seeks to naturalize. And in the rest of this paper, I want to spend time with one story that denaturalizes the dominant discourse of center and periphery that is so prevalent in Mormon missionary fiction. Paul Rollins' 2008 short story, The Garden, is set in South Africa, and it opens with an unnamed elder in a garden eating grapes. Highlighting the sense of the unfamiliar and foreign, these grapes are nothing like the ones he eats back home, purchased in the grocery store, but rather taste of, and I quote, wildness, something shocking and undomesticated, end quote. The elder is terrified and thinks that his companion is probably dead. He likens him to the martyr Stephen in his mind. Unless the Lord had come down and plucked him up or parted the way for him, he was certainly dead, dead as Stephen, stoned under the hands of an incensed mob, a martyr sure of heaven, end quote. Even though Elder Porter had been the faster runner, it is the unnamed elder who is alive to hide in this idyllic garden, described as filled with well-kept rows with leafy tops of potato plants, tomato bushes hung with small red bulbs, 2 short rows of corn, grapes that dangled from the vine. The garden, however lush it may be, is only a temporary safe haven, however. And the elder knows that, quote, for any chance he had, he might as well be on the moon, end quote. The story is imbued with a sense of not just the foreign, but the exotic too. When the elder received his mission call, everyone had been, quote, excited, as they all knew boys being sent as missionaries to Europe or South America, the Philippines, end quote, but not Africa. The elder had even pictured himself, quote, rumbling through the bush in a Land Rover, end quote, even as he knew that on the news, quote, the place was on fire, end quote. Now, hiding in the garden, looking back, the elder gets the first inkling that he may have been a little ignorant of the actual situation. At the time, his mother had been less happy about his mission call, and he wanted to, quote, she wanted to, quote, write the church, tell them they couldn't send her son into a war zone. There was always a war, his father had told her. Their son was enlisting in the army of God. He was already at war with the world, end quote. However, as primed as the missionary is to face it, for the first 9 months, it is indifference rather than war that the elder sees. He serves in the white cities and suburbs, where his only interaction with non-whites is with the black maids who answer the door when he knocks. The elder finds himself growing despondent and then indifferent himself and lazy, and far removed from, quote, the riots that happened in the townships. There were killings there, necklacings, there was danger. The townships, that's where the war was. And finally, that's where the elders find themselves transferred. They could not live there, but the township was their field of labor, a field black and ready to harvest. Here they did not knock on endless doors like salesmen. Here they served, struggling to look after the needs of their people. And here they also find success, teaching in homes where one convert invited a half dozen friends to share what he had found. Here the elder had begun to find a sweet taste to the work. Where the whites, among whom he had labored for the first 8 months, seemed limp and apathetic, amongst the blacks and the coloreds, the missionaries had found good ground, softened and thirsty for the refreshing of the latter rain, end quote. Until one day, when he and his companion had quote, turned a corner, excited, jabbering about the upcoming baptismal service, enjoying for the first time success in the work, the sheaves they were gathering in, end quote. Oblivious, they walk right into a riot. They see, quote, the necklace, the burning tire forced down around the arms of a black policeman, end quote, the body at the side of the road, and the mob, quote, a pulsing, thick-muscled whip, coiling in on itself and stretching out. They had seen this, he and Elder Porter, and the people had seen them, 2 white boys at the edge of the crowd. There was pointing and shouting, and the elders had run, end quote. Eventually, the elder is found in the garden by the old man whose garden it actually is. The boy and the old man stare at each other, shocked, before the man walks back into the house. But the boy stays where he is, terrified that, quote, now he is going to die. The mob would beat him. They would puncture and shred his body with makeshift pangas. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. They would burn him while he was still alive, end quote. But he does not leave the garden, even if he himself does not really know why. The narrator writes, perhaps it was the voice Elijah heard, small and still, that told him to stay, but he could do nothing else. No one came. Not the old black man, not a crowd of hostile boys, not an angel or vision. He prayed and no one came, and finally he falls asleep. In contrast to the elder, who doesn't actually receive a name during the story, the old black man does have a name. He is called Simon Bob, and he had been shocked, quote, near dead to find a white boy in his garden, end quote. That night, quote, he thought many times that he should go out and talk to him, to see where he had come from and what he was planning, but he did not. Only trouble could come from that, end quote. The next day, he learns from others that the boy he had found must have been the white missionary from America that the people of the township thought was dead. Simon Bob knows that if the boy is still alive, he must still be in danger, but he doesn't realize the boy is still in his garden until he comes back there the next night and finds him there still in the same spot, hiding in the dirt. The boy then had spent the day wondering if his companion was still alive and fasting for deliverance. Much of the day, as best he could as he circled and squirmed to keep out of the sun, he had spent in prayer, an hour cataloging and begging forgiveness for his sins, ceaseless cries for deliverance. No thoughts had come to him, no answer, no way, and he thought now, if the situation did not change, he may do as Jesus had done, go 40 days in the wilderness without a taste of bread. And when Satan came to sit him on the pillar of the temple, he would go with him as far as the edge of the location, to the first white streets of town, and then he would turn and run from the devil, end quote. Here and in other places in the story, the elder imagines himself in a scriptural narrative, and always in the hero's role. In the passage above, he is Jesus being tempted by the devil. Later on in the text, he, quote, opens the scriptures and reads stories of deliverance. Daniel from the den of lions, Meshach, Shadrach, and, I'm not good at these biblical pronunciations. Abednego from the fiery furnace, Alma and Amulek from death in prison, David from the hand of Saul, end quote. Less of a comfort, in the New Testament, he reads stories of martyrs like James, Stephen, Peter, and Paul. While he wonders whether he will be a living victor or a dead martyr, the elder, quote, waits on God. He waits for God to pluck him up and spirit him away, to sleep, wake, and find himself miraculously somewhere else, to feel the assurance that he could rise up and walk unnoticed through the streets, the eyes of his enemies holden, and pass through the crowds like Jesus did through the Pharisees at the temple, end quote. The elder may self-identify with these biblical giants, However, as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that it is Simon Bob that takes on the role of hero, and even that of Jesus in this narrative instead. Simon Bob does not ask much of life. His son was arrested and tortured by the police, is now dead. His daughter had her first baby at 15 and now lives far away. He says, or the narrative says, that he takes comfort in, quote, the small things. His papers were in order. He had a place for his garden, no trouble with his wife. The Christians had told him that his son was alive somewhere with Jesus. That was good enough for Simon Bob. That was all, end quote. When the boy and the old man meet again, the boy is still assured of his primacy in God's eyes and is still not thinking of the danger that he is putting Simon Bob in. He asks, "Don't you think God would want you to help me? Maybe God brought me here because you're the only one who could help." Automatically, the elder brings out his missionary materials, and when Simon Bob asks, "Is your God in that book?" the elder shows him the quintessential Mormon picture of Joseph Smith receiving his first vision. However, the picture only serves to underscore the chasm between the two, as Simon Bob dryly remarks, "Your God is white," and the boy does not know how to respond. Eventually, knowing how much danger the boy is still in, Simon Bob decides that he, quote, would give the boy over to the Christians. God then could do with him what he would, end quote. His pastor, working in the townships, has solved many problems and crises over the years, and he will solve this one too, Simon thinks. After visiting his pastor and coming back home, he finds the boy still in the garden, but now he has been joined by Daniel, his grandson. Simon Bob tries to defuse the situation, but Daniel is set on revenge after years of oppression and threatens to kill the boy. And Simon Bob ends up hitting his grandson with some of his garden tools in order to protect the boy. Daniel leaves, but both Simon Bob and the boy know that it's a temporary reprieve at best. As feared, when they leave the garden to go to the church, as the pastor has instructed, Simon Bob and the boy run into the angry men bent on revenge. Caught in an impossible situation, the elder reacts the only way he knows how, and, quote, takes a few hopping steps to the side, putting the old man between himself and the crowd, end quote. He is ready to run when, out of nowhere, a church choir dressed in purple robes processes by. As they walk, the choir members sing, quote, looking beyond him as if there were no white boy gaping at them from the side of the meager road as they came marching, no pack of wolves on the next corner waiting to do murder, end quote. In the confusion of the procession, they are able to, quote, flock around him in their purple vestments, folding him into their undulating sea and bearing him away, end quote. Days before, the boy does not see if his companion is running with him. Now, he does not see if the old man has been swept along with them either. He does not see because he does not look. The choir neatly deposits him into the trunk of a waiting car, and only when they stop at the edge of town and he's let out does he even stop to think about the old man who has saved him. He hopes that the moment before the choir entered the street, when he had broken away from the old man's grasp, would be enough to save Simon Bob. Yet he knows that it is unlikely, and as, quote, the poisons of adrenaline and fear, end quote, leave his body, they are replaced with what the narrator calls mystery and grief. Simon Bob is left in the township, and he goes back to the garden he has worked so hard to cultivate. The narrator says, nothing grew in the thin dust of the township. It had taken years to build this soil. Simon Bob continues to work in his garden that night, as, quote, shadows bloomed along the ground, thinking of a boy, until he heard footsteps coming up behind him. Then he propped his hoe against the garden wall and turned around to meet them, end quote. In the story, the garden has echoes of two gardens from the Bible. It is the Garden of Eden, the paradise from which Adam and Eve have been expelled, a refuge for Simon Bob who built it, and the elder who was sheltered in it. But it's also the Garden of Gethsemane, in which Jesus prays the night before his deliverance to the Romans and his crucifixion, and where Simon Bob waits for the violence he knows will come. This biblical narrative is especially important in the Mormon theological imagination, as Mormons locate Jesus' atoning sacrifice in the garden as well as on the cross. And this solidifies Simon Bob's identification with Jesus. In the garden, Rollins set Simon Bob up to be the hero, and it's Simon Bob who recognizes the shared humanity between himself and the white missionary and acts to save someone very different from himself, even though it will cost him his life. At the beginning of the text, the elders at the center of the story, sent to bring salvation to the township. At the end, the elders on the margins, saved and redeemed by Simon Bob and the unknown church choir. This flips the rhetoric of center and periphery that is so prevalent in LDS discourse. Stories like these demonstrate that the symbolic boundaries that keep up the hierarchy of geography and culture a hierarchy that keeps America firmly at the top, are not fixed and impermutable, but rather can be deconstructed and remediated. Reading these and other texts for the dislocations between discourses opens up space for another kind of missionary story, one that highlights the incredible richness that is to be found in the transnational landscape and recognizes that to ignore the global is to tell but half the Mormon story. Thank you.